Hello, my name's Julie Williams. I'm a registered migration agent with Migration Down Under. Now you've got your permanent residency and you're wanting to know what's next. Perhaps you've remained in Australia and you haven't really left other than for holidays or work purposes, and you're seeking to become an Australian citizen. How do you become an Australian citizen? Well, it's not that difficult. Once you're a permanent resident and you're decided that Australia is going to be your permanent place of residence, then Australian citizenship is a good option for you, especially in unknown times as we are today with the COVID-19 pandemic. Having that security of having Australian citizenship is always a good thing, especially if you've got children that have been born here and have become citizens, and or perhaps you've got the ability to hold more than one citizenship, or you don't want to relinquish your citizenship. Fair enough. There's a lot of countries, as Australia does, that recognises dual citizenship. So it doesn't necessarily mean, dependent on the country that you've come from, that you need to relinquish your own citizenship. Now, becoming an Australian citizen, what that entitles you to, obviously a passport, being able to travel freely around as an Australian citizen. It also gives you a right to vote and access into certain areas of perhaps government where you can't usually enter if you're not an Australian citizen. So perhaps you're a permanent resident and you want to apply for a security job maybe in the government, and you have to be a citizen, then it's a good option to become a citizen. But how do you become a citizen? Then if you have resided in Australia for a minimum of 4 years and 1 year as a permanent resident, so perhaps you've been here for a while on a working holiday, maybe a temporary work visa, and you've only just recently got your permanent residency. If you've been here for 4 years and 1 year as a permanent resident, then you can apply for citizenship by conferral. It's an online application. The payment, the government payment, is not nearly as much as what you possibly paid for permanent residency. The process does take quite some time because there is a long queue, and you're looking at about 12 months from the moment you lodge your application until you complete your citizenship. Now, with the current pandemic, there aren't any citizenship tests being conducted, but citizenship ceremonies are going on as usual, but they are done through a virtual ceremony for those that are interested in doing their citizenship like that. In regards to people that are under 16 or over 60, you don't actually need a citizenship test. So it's just more about providing all your identification. So, citizenship is not onerous. I think the most difficult part is, if you've travelled a lot, is trying to remember all the dates all the overseas trips you've done. But as long as you've been living here for 4 years, you haven't been outside of Australia for greater than 12 months, and you haven't in the last 4 years, and you haven't been outside of Australia for more than 90 days in the last 12 months, then you are eligible for Australian citizenship. Children under 16 can be all included in your application for no additional fee and no additional forms. So it's always a good idea to include the whole family if you have come as part of the family. Now, perhaps you're overseas, you gained your permanent residency some time ago, and there's often a lot of confusion with people, and those that are also here in Australia. They think the 5-year resident return visa marks the end of their permanent residency, but it doesn't. Your permanent residency is indefinite as long as you're remaining residing in Australia, because the idea of applying for permanent residency is because you've decided that Australia is where you want to be on a permanent basis. So therefore you've applied, you've gained your residency, and you can stay here indefinitely without doing anything further. The only thing that is issued and that expires, that's granted alongside your permanent residency, is what's called the Multiple Re-entry Resident Return Visa. And that allows you to travel freely in and out of Australia as often as you like, and as a permanent resident of Australia. Now, it expires every 5 years because the government want to make sure that you actually genuinely want to live and remain living here in Australia. So if you've lived here for a minimum of 2 of those 5 years, then applying for a resident return visa is quite simple, and it will get granted usually sort of it's computer generated, so usually, within moments of lodging it, or at least, perhaps 24 hours. But if you haven't been residing here for at least 2 out of the 5 years, then it is going to be a little bit more difficult for you. And you do need to prove that you are you're considering Australia as your permanent place of residence. So if you're already here in Australia, then and you've got a need to travel overseas and your resident return visa has expired, then usually it's quite easy to apply for another one to allow yourself to travel and then return back. It may be that if you don't meet the 2 out of the 5 year residency requirement, that you'll only get a 1 year resident return visa. So that is making certain that you are genuine about your desire to remain permanently here in Australia. So it's not a visa for somebody that's been overseas for the last 4 years, hasn't stepped foot into Australia, but wants to reactivate their resident return visa. It's not something that's going to continue to extend your residency if you're going to remain in overseas, because the idea of the resident return is to allow you to travel overseas as a resident of Australia. So if you're not a resident of Australia, then it's not something to extend your permanent residency. It's a little hard to understand and explain, possibly. But yes, look, if you're not, the resident return is for those people that are genuinely living in Australia and have got a need to travel overseas. It's not vice versa. It's not those people that have been living overseas all that time and then all of a sudden wanting to come back to Australia, wanting to extend their permanent residency. If you're wanting to return to Australia and your resident return visa has expired, or perhaps it is expiring, then you will be able to extend that resident return to enable you to enter Australia before either at a later date than what your resident return is expiring at the moment. But be aware, they may only extend it for a maximum of 12 months, not another 5 years. So you will need to return back within those 12 months, otherwise you may not get another shot at it. Depending on how long you've been overseas, it may be that you're only going to get a 3-month return visa so that they can see that you've got a genuine desire to return and remain living here in Australia on a permanent basis. So, because as a permanent resident, as you're aware, you can access the free education, you can access free healthcare. And so the Australian government want to see that if you're doing that, that you're also contributing to the economy by remaining here on a permanent basis. But if you are currently overseas and wanting to return whilst the current pandemic is on, then that is also an option to apply for the resident return visa. It's dependent on your circumstances as to whether you'll get it and for how long. But once you do, then it would be possible to return to Australia on that. But there's a lot of information on our website. Stay tuned for our social media updates. Otherwise, if there's something that you think that you'd like our assistance with in applying on your behalf for your resident return or your citizenship, don't hesitate in giving us a call on our office number 02 9419 5411. Otherwise, you can always find us on the website info@migrationdownunder.com.